Good evening. And welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for our Aquarian Minyan author series. It's wonderful to look out and see all of your shining faces. And we have a very stimulating and inspiring program planned for you that I know everyone will enjoy. My name is Jill Cohen, and I'm the chairperson and the coordinator of the Aquarian Minyan author series, which has been in existence now for over 8 years. Our featured guest this evening is well known to most of you, REUVEN GOLDFARB and his wife, Goliath. I'm going to join in the applause. Our former shomers and service leaders of the Minyan. Many of our Shabbats and memorable celebrations were held at their home in Berkeley through the years. REUVEN and Yehudit now live in the sacred and mystical town of Sfat in the northern part of Israel, where REUVEN hosts a monthly salon and also a weekly short story intensive. REUVEN is a prolific and highly regarded writer of almost every genre you can imagine that even exists, and that includes poetry, essays, short stories, articles, and opinion pieces. He has been widely published in magazines, newspapers, and anthologies. It feels important also to share that Yehudit is also a fine writer and scholar and editor. She teaches both Kabbalah and literature and is the creator of the healing movement form called Otiyot Hayot. And this is based on the Hebrew letters and was inspired by Yehudit's background in Tai Chi. She is also a certified Brima practitioner as well, and both REUVEN and Yehudit run a movement and healing center from their home in Sfat. REUVEN received smicha from Reb Salman as Morenu Magid and rabbinic deputy in 1993, and we're just thrilled to have REUVEN with us this evening. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to our friend and holy brother, REUVEN.
Thank you very much, Jill. I really want to meet this guy. He sounds,
Know thyself.
Socrates, yeah. Gosh, it's really nice to be here. Let's start with a song. Shomer, Shomer, Yisrael. Shomer, Shomer, Yisrael. Shomer, Sherit Yisrael. Shomer, Sherit Yisrael. V'al Yovad, V'al Yovad, V'al Yovad, Yisrael. Omrim Ma Yisrael. O guardian of Yisrael. O guardian of Yisrael. Protect, protect Yisrael. Protect, protect Israel. Let no harm, let no harm, let no harm reach Israel. Who's still whispering? Shema Yisrael. Yadadai, yadadai, yadadai. Yadadai, yadadai, yadadai. Yeah. people call you on, and if you have a button that makes it stop, prevents them from doing that, you could maybe, just change the setting, whatever it takes, so we won't be interrupted.
Do you mean turn the damn thing off?
Yeah.
Oh.
Thanks, Dan. I want to extend special thanks to Jill, who was a lot like me in that she's very detail-oriented and maybe has a little bit of a perfectionist streak. And this could be, challenging. People have to work with her, but it wasn't challenging for me because we were actually on the same page about everything. We cared about details.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and so we can relax because, we don't have to explain everything to each other. It's all important.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And Corey Cody at the table in Faith, backing up Jill and Claudia for the food, and all the other people who schlepped, and Dan, of course, for the taping, and Shmuel Klein for providing the camera, and Leah for coming in just when she was supposed to. Anyway, so now no one else is coming, right? Close the doors. All right. So this is not my first time standing at this microphone or something like it.
That's great.
I think I've read maybe 4 times now, or will have after tonight. I think I read something about baseball Kabbalah the first time, and people started taking me out to the ball game before I even opened my mouth. It was a lot of fun. And then I've read other things, poetry and stories, and I said to myself, okay, next year I'm not going to read anything that anyone here has heard before. Okay, with the exception of UD. It's all new stuff, you haven't heard it. No recycled and no old favorites. That's too bad. But you can ask. I'm expected to read about 45 minutes. I think it's a comfortable length. And it's going to be a mixture of poetry and prose. I have books for sale in the back. You can browse later on. The prices are including marked. You should have no trouble figuring it out. You take the money and give you change. There are bathrooms here. If you're a man, there's a room for you. It's out that door and around to the right. If you're a woman, there's a room for you. But I don't know where it is. To the left. Okay. So, there we go. The right wing and the left wing meet right here. So Yahweh McLean is fond of saying, you need 2 wings to fly. So I'm going to start with some short poems. This one was written, I wouldn't say it was a challenge, but it was at the suggestion of my sister-in-law, Karen Edwards, Yehudit's brother's wife. And we had gone on a walk to Devorah Falls, a really beautiful place in the Golan. And on our way back, we're going to eat at Gan Eden, a restaurant in Sfat. She said, wouldn't it be great if all of us would write a poem and then share it over dinner? So I immediately composed a poem in my head and wrote it down later. And then the idea was we'll send it to the kids. And so I managed to collect 2 of the poems that had been written besides my own, and one of them just remains out there. And I'm not going to send them to the kids if we don't have all 4 of us. So this is the one I wrote. It's called Ancient Ruins. Gold lichen glistens on top of a wall. Gray stone quickens the sense of it all. White moon listens, though no birds call. And I had an issue with this poem because there was one word in it that could have gone 4 different ways. So I'll read it again with a replacement word. And I'm going to ask you for your feedback. Ancient ruins. Gold lichen glistens on top of the wall. Hewn stone quickens the sense of it all. White moon listens, though no birds call. Which word changed? Thanks for paying attention. No, seriously. Did you hear a difference between the 2 versions? I mean, don't guess. You're sure.
We're reading both again now.
All right.
We were listening the first time.
Do you feel like I'm putting you down? I'm sorry.
There's more resonance.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's like a quiz show, right? There was one word different.
You expect everybody to
If I read it again, I'm going to put a third word in there. So I'm going to read it again with a different word.
Okay.
Okay.
It's all the same word.
Now listen closely. Gold lichen glistens on top of a wall. Smooth stone quickens the sense of it all. White moon listens, though no birds call. Which is the different word?
Listen. Glisten or listen.
This is just a test. Right? A test. You're going to get some younger people.
I think it was glisten or listen.
Both of them appeared in all three versions.
It's smooth.
The moon appears in all three versions. Smooth. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay.
Because it was moving the last time.
That's right. And the first time it was gray. And actually, so the order, originally I wrote smooth stone quickens the sense of it all. And all I was doing was describing the stone. But obviously it's supposed to have some resonance. What is the sense of it all? What does it mean that it's smooth? Well, that it's worn. I could have said worn stone quickens the sense of it all. This is it's a ruin, so it's ancient. So worn stone. Okay. And then, but in fact it was gray. And because I have gold in the first stanza and white in the last stanza, why don't I have gray? So we have the three colors. It's symmetrical. So I tried that. And then it came to me hewn, because that shows that human beings shape the stone. And I liked that idea. I was very excited about that one. I felt I had finally solved the problem. And then gray came back. And it sort of tickled my shoulder and said, but the colors, man, you know. So I don't know. I have 4 versions of this poem, and they're all the same except for one word. When it comes to poetry, you know, it's supposed to close like a box. Every word is supposed to fit. And maybe all 4 versions are just as good as every other.
There you go. Hello.
So this is what you do in a case like this. You send it to 4 different editors, and the one that accepts the poem, that's the right version.
I like that.
But what?
I like that.
You should be lucky at least one of them. All right, I just wanted to start with something easy. Now, the next poem, what do you think?
I think smooth.
You think smooth, the first one is the best?
No.
Well, look, I have some opinions. Who says smooth?
Read it once more, we can vote.
How about hewn? How about gray? And how about,
Yeah.
what was the other one?
Smooth.
I said smooth, I said gray. Worn. How about worn?
I like one.
Okay, well, the voting is about the same for each, just as I would expect. Well, I'm glad that the council doesn't have to decide about this.
We let the gods decide.
What, Mindy?
I think you should pick the word that makes all the other words stand out. Because you've been fixating on this one word,
Yes.
but
Hi, Nancy.
something subtle. Subtle that makes because I was focusing on the other words in the poem.
You can put all 4.
And these are my problems, you know. I don't know who said it, but a writer is someone who, in the morning, adds a comma, and in the afternoon takes it out.
I think you need to translate it into Hebrew.
Maybe then it'll become more clear. That's a great idea. I'll work on it. Thank you so much. That's a brilliant notion.
I like that. That's a great suggestion.
I might lose the rhyme.
In Yetzirah, it's smooth.
I know, but
In
it's still funny.
Maria, it would be hewn, and in Atzilut, it's...
Did you hear this? This is what years of study Kabbalah will do.
Yeah.
They're all good, but in different worlds. Okay. Now, Len, again, in the world of
I say
Asiya,
it's gray.
gray. In the world of
Yetzirah, it's smooth, it's a feeling. Right?
smooth, yeah.
Yeah, and then
In Bria, it's hewn.
Human interaction.
Because it's the world of, like, you know, building things. And then in Atzilut,
That's the ancient of days is worn.
worn.
Wow.
Wow, brilliant.
Okay, well, this is what I use this community for.
I
Good
love it. That's
feedback and
wonderful.
interactive.
I love it.
Learning.
That's great.
Yeah. Okay, well, that was terrific. Now we'll go on to the next poem. Now, this one actually kind of addresses the local issue. could say, although it certainly wasn't meant to. But since I've been away, I know there's been some changes in the Bay Area, and sometimes issues come up that in Israel we say, huh? But here we say, oh no, not again. So this is called Brit Milah. And so how many people remember David Zeller?
Oh,
Bless his memory.
Oh,
David, one of our real culture heroes, one of our best friends, one of our best teachers, scholars, singers, composers, a rare treasure, and lost too soon. Well, David left a family behind, and his son Mordecai is a good friend of ours and a teacher in Sfat. He teaches Zohar on Parsha every week. A great person, a young person, but he really followed in his father's footsteps. After he died and his father was buried and he recovered, he went to India and followed in his father's footsteps and made it his business to meet all the great people that David met when he was a pilgrim, when he was a sadhu. Because David was a sadhu in India, barefoot for a year, and Mordecai went to walk in his footsteps. He got married about a year and a half ago. Terrific lady. And he's also performed a number of weddings, but we're very fond of his wife, and they had a son in April. In May. Okay, so we traveled to Yerushalayim. The baby was born in Yerushalayim for the Brit, and it was an incredible occasion. It was held in the synagogue in a part of Jerusalem, in Minyan Moshe. It's the synagogue that Leah's great-great-grandfather built. So there was a Brit Yitzchak the night before, and it was held at Leah's parents' house in Har Nof. So it was like more Zohar on Parsha, but specifically the Parsha that has to do with the Brit Milah, as described in Torah, the headquarters of Brit Milah, in the Parsha that describes the Brit of Yitzchak, the son of Abraham. So I was inspired a lot by the teachings then and on another occasion when we met in Sfat. So this poem was written in Yerushalayim, and it was like written that night and then revised the day of the Brit and then revised again on the next day. So it finally came out like this, and I have no changes to suggest. And it's for Kol David, and Kol David is the name that Leah and Mordecai gave their son. Kol David, the voice of David.
Oh, that's beautiful.
What can you say?
Gorgeous.
The scar on my corona, the edge of my glands, is God's name tag, imprinted on my tender skin, so that the angels know when I go through the laundry and come out dripping and cleansed, that I am to be returned to Him. My father offered me to God, and the moil, my father's agent, took God's share, a fraction, a sliver, with precise skill, and in the merit of my father's and mother's surrender, returned me to them. I want to see that published. Thanks. Very nice response. Okay, the next poem. We were also learning the Zohar the night I wrote this, and again, it got revised a couple of times, and I sent it around to the people who were in the class, and they gave me feedback. It's called Champions. Hebrews 1, Philistines nothing. The epigraph is from the first book of Samuel, and the Philistine cursed David by his God. Hi, Shana. Yeah. So where am I voice? Did you hear the title?
I did.
Good. Goliath by cursing David, denies David's God. Intending by this to rattle him, for he's a heckler. Yet he's also David's cousin, descended from Orpah, the sister of Ruth, 3 generations back. To the spectators, he's the Philistines' big slugger, their cleanup hitter, their mighty Casey. David is the rookie pitcher, the phenom. He's the fireballer with his sling and stone. Goliath is a primordial creature, armed with a sword, a spear, long and heavy as a weaver's beam, and a javelin of brass. He's like the Cyclops, whom Odysseus killed by burning out his single eye with a sharpened red-hot stick of olive wood. David slings a stone into the center of Goliath's forehead that stretches him out, face down in the dirt. Yes, David beamed him. 1 pitch, lights out. They played the game rougher in those days. So that goes in the poetry supplement to Baseball Couple. Okay, so now I'm going to read some more personal stuff. You know, one good thing that's happened to me this year is I've been in a couple of writing workshops. There's a graduate school of creative writing at Berkeley University that has writers in residence. And this year they had a winter writers seminar with a writer named Robert Cohen, who teaches at Middlebury College. I'd never really heard of the guy, but he was a fabulous teacher. I still haven't read his stories and novels, but I intend to. But I came to the group, which met we had 3 or 4 sessions, several hours duration, morning and afternoon with a lunch break. And I came with the idea there was something I wanted to write about. And I'll read the first part of it. Basically, I wrote chapters of a work in progress called Intersections. And it starts off with a real intersection, a genuine intersection, Avenue M and Bedford Avenue.
Brooklyn.
That's correct. And it evidently goes on to other types of intersections. Let me read the first one. And so the first chapter was M and Bedford, the second chapter was Derelictions, the third chapter, Poetry and Possessions, the third, Transitions, and the fourth, Delwood. I don't know if I'm going to read all of these, but I'll read, I combined the first 2 into a short story because it held together as a piece that had unity in beginning, middle, and end, and I could send it out and see if it would meet with a response in the publishing world. So let me do that one first, and then we'll just see where we're holding. Intersections, M and Bedford. I was 9 years old. My parents had moved my brother and me to a newly bought house in a neighborhood rather far from where I had lived all my life. This distance, while not insuperable, severed me from my accustomed haunts, the streets and homes of my friends on East 28th Street. I wandered the streets of my new neighborhood, an alien to this alien landscape. I walked past a corner house with a broad driveway and a double-width garage, to which was affixed a backboarded rim. A knot of boys, wilder than I, was sassing the owner, a woman in her middle years. I scarcely heard the slur that passed their lips, but I must have heard the word Jew issued from among them, from the most forward and daring of the bunch. What I definitely heard was the woman's searing reply as she shouted, "Don't you ever say that! Don't you ever dare to speak that way!" Even at a distance of more than 50 years, I cannot forget the shattering indignation of her tone, the devastating critique of their thoughtless utterance, the passionate and proud defense of the survivor. The boys wilted and quailed before her onslaught. They withdrew in confusion and defensiveness and banished themselves from her presence. A part of me nodded in approval and respect for her bravery and the justice of her riposte. Another part of me was shocked by her outrage. Flash forward a few years. I don't know who lives in that house. The same woman? Perhaps with her husband, perhaps children, or not. My friends and I are walking along Bedford Avenue, bouncing a basketball. We see the court and we wonder, could we play there? We have never seen anyone on that court. We decide to try. After a few bounces and a couple of shots, the woman of the house comes out. The same woman, her husband right behind them, right behind her, both of them angry over our trespass. She chases us away with harsh imprecations, waving her hands and shouting, "How dare you come on this property and make yourselves at home here?" She might have said, if I could remember her exact words, now obliterated by my memory of her fury over our intrusion. We sheepishly withdrew. I guess we had guessed wrong. Not every family was like the Hells, who built a concrete court in back of their house and allowed all the neighborhood kids to play there. Okay, we should have asked. We might have done better to ask. When I had first come to this neighborhood, literally as the new kid on the block, I had met another kid, also named Robert. Wiry and tough, though about my size with a couple of pals of his. He challenged my right to be on his block, gestured threateningly and gave me a shove. As he had two guys to back him up, I felt outnumbered and made a split-second decision to run. He was fast, but I was faster. I outdistanced him and sped home around the corner, at which point he decided not to follow me. I was still smarting from this reception when a while later 2 other guys approached me and introduced themselves as Nick and his younger brother, Elliot. Nick offered me his hand to shake and actually said, "We want to be your friends." But at that point I was too mistrustful to reciprocate. "Yeah," I said, hardened and cynical. But let's go back in time. In the fall of 1953, when I was only 8 years old and still living on Avenue J, my friend Johnny Grumet, was he a real friend or only a classmate, invited me to come over to his house on a weekday morning to take off from school and go to his house instead. I agreed. That morning I left my house as usual and lingered in the backyard, hiding until my friends from East 28th Street, Michael and his little sister, David and his little brother Eddie, the violin player, would pass. But they spied me as they reached our driveway, a broad space between 2 semi-detached houses. Offered a good angled shot from the sidewalk and called out to me, "Robert, hey Robert, we see you!" I pretended not to see them and not to hear them. They persisted, but I retreated further into the shrubbery and refused to respond. Eventually they gave up and continued walking to school. I knew at some level I was betraying them. In fact, the whole adventure I had planned in secret council with Johnny Grumet constituted an evasion of all my relationship obligations to my parents, my teacher, and my friends. Why had I accepted the lure of playing hooky? I can guess why. My brother had spoken of kids he knew who played hooky. He gave it over at dinner, partly to shock and test my parents, no doubt. He made it sound like a glamorous pursuit, a daring break for freedom. So I followed suit. Who was Jonathan Grumet? A very conceited boy, a braggart, and a show-off with a nasty tongue. He referred with a sneer to his nigger maid. He vaunted his name, his name, Grumet, as high-toned sounding, perfect in its syllabic order and emphasis. I couldn't see or hear what he saw and heard in it, but he was convinced. No point arguing if he believed it. He must have been a super salesman to get me to leave the pattern of my days and join him in this conspiracy. He'd given me precise directions to his house, but not the address. And yes, dear reader, it was around the corner and across the street from the house with the rim in the driveway. It was also across the street, 1 block away from the house my parents would buy in just a few months. I was making a foray to that new neighborhood ahead of them, probably before they'd ever committed to signing a contract or even located a place where they would live for the next 32 years. By then, I had ceased taking seriously my parents' interest in houses. We'd made many visits to new developments on Long Island and to family homes for sale in Brooklyn without buying any of these places. But one day that spring, my brother whispered to me that this time they were really going to do it. They had bought a house, and they were going to move there over the summer while we were at camp. I was incredulous. I went into the next room and tearfully asked my parents if it were true. Well, yes. I call that a betrayal, don't you? How could they have told him and not me? Don't you think they should have sat us both down and broken the news as frankly and gently as they could? Did they not understand how hard it would be for me to leave Avenue J? I know they had their reasons. They were renting and wanted to own their own place, a bigger place. They felt that Jerry, then 14, who slept on the sun porch, needed his own room. I had inherited the small bedroom we had both occupied for my first 5 years. But Mr. and Mrs. Miller, our landlord and landlady who lived upstairs, were like grandparents to me. They gave me books for my birthday, Robinson Crusoe and Black Beauty, and allowed me to visit. I remember the smell of Mrs. Miller's face powder and Dick Miller's pipe smoke. It's true that several friends of mine on my block had moved away earlier. Mark Slavin to Wilmington, Amy and Susie Miller to Green Acres, Bunny to Philadelphia. But I had found other friends a mere block and a half away, in the middle of East 28th Street. I could walk over after school and play until supper time. Nearly all my memories and daily habits were rooted in this few block area. Now I was to move to Avenue M. Well, not too long out of state, it is true, but 3 long avenue blocks, a world away it seemed. I could not easily walk from there and then walk home, and I hadn't yet learned how to ride a two-wheeler. So I was being uprooted, and there was nothing I could do about it. So that's where the first chapter ended. And the next chapter is called Derelictions, but now they've been combined. Walking to Johnny's was not simply a straight line. In order to get there, I had to circumvent the school. PS 193, located at Avenue L in Bedford. I chose to go north across Bedford to one of the side streets, then traverse the intervening avenues and head down M to Johnny's. Having eluded Michael and David, I was surprised to see Paul Cronenberg, another classmate and fellow poet, setting off for school from his house, perhaps 100 feet ahead of me on the other side of the street as I made my stealthy way to the home of my criminal ally. Again, I tried to conceal myself, ducking beside a hedge, and to defend myself against capture by seizing the only weapon I could find, a flimsy piece of aluminum TV antenna, which I slapped in my palm a couple of times, pretending that it was a club. Paul was a close pal of mine and Michael's, with whom we used to walk home after school and collaborate on a long rhyme poem or a parody, and stop to buy trading cards, the kind that later became collector's items. However, because of my weird determination, that day I perceived him as a potential enemy for whom I needed to hide and against whom I needed to arm myself. How ludicrous the whole situation was. But I could not back out. I'd given my word that I would appear, and as there is honor among thieves, so there is commitment among conspirators. When Paul had faded out of sight, I continued on my journey. The upshot of my visit to Jonathan Grumetz was not pretty. In the middle of our morning pastimes, while we played with games and toys, and the warm sunlight streamed into his bedroom, his family's housekeeper appeared at the door. "Oh, Johnny," she said, "your principal's on the phone. He's mad." Had someone squealed on us? How did he know where we were? Look, if you can read this, or understand this, you know that kids can be oblivious to how closely they are observed and how little is hidden from adult eyes. Even one might say especially the acts of concealing, of hiding, of sequestering oneself, objects, and intentions draw attention and are easily discerned and interpreted by observant adults. Of course, sometimes adults are oblivious too. Yes, and sometimes adults act like children and attempt to conceal thefts, adulteries, and other intrigues from prying eyes. Indeed, it's amazing how much they imagine they can get away with. Perhaps it's only after one has had children that one begins to realize how guileless they actually are and how susceptible we all are to seduction and flattery. 2 boys are missing from a 4th grade class. The teacher wonders aloud where they are. A student volunteers that on his way to school he had seen one of them. The teacher reports this information to the office. The secretary, and in our case it appears that it was the principal himself, makes calls to the homes of the 2 missing boys and tracks down the miscreants at the home of one of them. The boys are called in separately for a showdown with this dominant authority figure. Yes, I was there in the principal's office with my mother. Principal Blickstein asked me some pointed questions, and I cried and admitted my guilt. Later I compared notes with Johnny, who, in the wake of the first phone call, had boasted, "I'll say to him, 'Look here, Mr. Blickstein.'" He too had cried. Thank you. You know, I call these fictionalized autobiography. I also write alternate reality fiction. And you know, why is it fictionalized? After all, didn't I try to write down things exactly as I remembered them? Well, before I left Israel, I was like rooting through some old papers, and I found. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, I brought it. Look at this. In 1975, I was living in San Francisco on 15th Street, and my friend Baker Bart was growing some pot, very luxurious plants, and they were visible from the street. And he had been busted for something before, and so I think what happened was some kid had tried to steal the plants, and so the kid was like arrested for stealing, and then they discovered what he was stealing, and then the cops came, and Bart went out the back door because he couldn't afford to get picked up again. And his girlfriend, Vimla, who was also my housemate, and I were busted. And it was so ironic because the guy next door to us was a big coke dealer. And people used to come up, bang on his door in the middle of the night because they were cokeheads and they needed bad, what they needed. And I mean, one night, Vima opened the door because it was very disturbing at 3 in the morning to have someone pounding on the door next door to you. And she said, "If you don't be quiet and go away, I'm going to throw this water on you." And the guy kept pounding on the door, so he threw the water on. She threw the water on him and slammed the door. And, I mean, these are the kinds of things that happen. So for us to get busted, we're just like harmless little pot growers. It wasn't even my pot or her pot. And the guy next door is getting away scot-free, and he's dealing loads and loads of cocaine, to all these people, I mean, a very unobservant constabulary. So anyway, you got me a lawyer. And Bart knew this person, was a good lawyer, one lawyer. What was her name? Remember her name? An office downtown. Actually, wasn't the office in Berkeley? Okay, whatever it was. Anyway, so I had a parole officer, and I was writing stuff for the parole officer. Eventually the whole thing was erased. I wrote a lot about myself and my family and my history. And when I pulled this thing out of whatever box I had stashed it in, I found the same story I had written. And I'd forgotten that I had actually written it before. But, so that's why I'm saying it's fictionalized autobiography, because there are details in here. This is the Xerox, I made it Xerox, so I shouldn't lose the original invaluable document. And so when I reread it, maybe it's not as good as a story, but the facts are a little more clear, because, I had a little better recall that long ago, that much closer to the incident. So even when we try to tell the truth, we always shade it a little bit or shape it a little bit. It's not exactly what happened. But what's important, I think, is that we have the gist of it. And that's why I think sometimes writing about something that happened long, long ago is much better than writing about something very recent. When you write about something very recent, it's very raw, it's very new, you remember all these details. It's very hard to evaluate what's important and what's less important. It's all important, but and you don't, if you wait a long time, time sifts our memories so that the really important things remain intact for us, and the less important things don't have to be recalled for the recall to be legitimate and sound and valuable. Of course, I still remember quite a bit. So hopefully this is a form that is worth sharing. Now, I could read more chapters. I have more chapters, and I think I should. Don't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Good.
So, Reuven, if you'd like to take a brief break at some point,
No.
that's an option. So just please,
Okay.
let us know.
I have a question.
Yes.
How was the
wrote closer to the facts, different from the version you wrote recently of that story?
Well, I'd have to go over item by item, but there are various details that are slightly different than the first version. Like in the first version, I knew I had crossed over on 24th Street. But when I wrote it in the spring or in February, I didn't remember what street it was. So I think my earlier recollection is accurate. And that he hadn't given me his address. I didn't remember that when I wrote it in February. But it's obviously there in the earlier version. So I just threw it in now, you know. And little things like that. And the fact that, for example, as soon as I came out, it doesn't matter, see, but there are differences. And I think you'll find that if you compare a story you told 5 years ago with the same story you told yesterday, it's not the same story. And that's why, you know, when they question witnesses, you have to see if they come up with the same story. Shoot.
Is the style remarkably different, or is there similar?
I have to review the first version. I think it's different. I think it's cleaner and maybe more like toward an audience and not toward a parole officer.
Let's read some more stories. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Could you hold that question? Okay. Okay. So, let me see if I should read this one or that one. I think I better just read it consecutively, because who knows what I might be inadvertently skipping over of crucial importance to what comes later. So this is called Poetry on Possessions. If I still have a grievance against my mother, it has to do with her cavalier disposal of those childhood relics, worth thousands of bucks in the open market as little as 30 years later, due in part to their scarcity, easily explained by the propensity of many other moms to ditch their kids' collections. And this before collection bins for recycling cardboard became prevalent. Lost. As I dwell on her high-handed disposal of my trophies, I bitterly recall other instances of her misappropriation. What possessed her to give my tricycle, my pride, to Bunny's little brother Edgar, without informing me? I see you can relate to this. Oh God, I thought I was the only one. When I saw him riding it, I was shocked, and I tried to repossess it. Their mother, Gertrude, intervened, and I wound up punching her in the breast. That part of her anatomy nearest to me, in the melee. I wasn't aiming for it. I was swinging wildly. It swung out. My mother confirmed the transfer, excusing her action by claiming that I had not ridden it very much lately. Indeed, that I had outgrown it. How could I have outgrown it when I had not yet been provided with a more advanced form of transportation? That is, a two-wheeler. I was due to inherit Jerry's bike, but Jerry still rode his 26-inch model regularly, and it was too big for me anyway. But that's not all. Years later, when I went to meet at college, she gave my barbells to my cousin Arthur, again without explanation. Being generous with other people's possessions strikes me as a character flaw. One I intrinsically rebel against. What possessed her? A theory. My mother was the third of 4 sisters. When the youngest was a baby, my mother slept in a single bed, sandwiched between her 2 older sisters. I suspect she was not sure of her own place in her family, nor what was hers and what was not. I presume she was used to receiving hand-me-downs, then parting with them as her youngest sister grew. If that were the norm, surely I couldn't expect to own things forever. But were a neighbor's or a sister's child the same as a younger sibling? Evidently, to her outlook, they were. And the determination of when and to whom to pass along her own child's belongings belonged to her to act unilaterally, perhaps even impulsively, without consulting anyone else, especially not the child, the kinder. And yet disposal of what are known generically as trading cards, even though they were seldom if ever traded, into the trash, and of school papers and other documents of mine when my parents moved to California, suggests a level of indifference, even of hostility, that is hard to square with my mother's generally good-natured, caring, and devoted style of parenting. If anything, she was a helicopter parent, often hovering over my plans and actions, exercising what I consider unusual levels of control and supervision. And this, too, I explain, but do not excuse. As a first-generation American, the child of Romanian Jewish refugees who sought freedom and prosperity in the U.S. She had understandably to be protective of her children. Life was precious to us in the same proportion as our lives were cheap to our oppressors. In this perspective, a mother's job was to zealously guard her offspring's every moment, and even to make consequential decisions on his or her behalf. And there's another possibility. Perhaps she resented me. Perhaps she felt that she should have received the unconditional love that she bestowed on me. Perhaps, too, I was an ungrateful, even demanding recipient of her largesse. My lack of sufficient appreciation might have stung her. But it's also true that her giving was at times so lavish that it overran my boundaries and did not satisfy my real needs for respect and for recognition, on my own terms. However, let it be noted that my mother never sought to dispose of my coin collection, which I patiently accumulated by sifting through my father's pocket change, supplemented by trips with Richie to the rare coin shop in Lower Manhattan, where we purchased coins that had been minted in small numbers and were almost impossible to find in circulation. In those days, you could still find Liberty standing quarters, Buffalo nickels, and Mercury dimes in ordinary change, and among them, some rare ones. My mother recognized that these collections of diverse denominations possessed actual monetary value. But I presume she could not fathom how those easily obtainable packs of cards could ever be worth anything. Yeah. Like my family? You have a family like that?
Like them all. They're all wonderful.
This is called transitions. All right, do any more?
Yeah.
Okay. My father's approach was a bit different. My father's. He encouraged my penchant for independence. Once when I was no older than 7, and perhaps even younger, I asked permission to drive. My father handed me the wheel. We were tooling along on East 28th Street, the street I would later visit almost daily, approaching Avenue J from the east. As we were nearing the corner, I turned the wheel to the right, but I had miscalculated and steered the car toward the curb. My mother, appalled at my father's judgment, cried, "Sammy!" And my father at once corrected the car's wayward trajectory. I was a little abashed, for I had thought I knew what I was doing. It seemed I was less competent than I had imagined. Further practice would have to wait another dozen or so years. In general, he encouraged me to take greater risks than my mother would. I could sense his approval when I sought to go beyond my accustomed limits. What he was strict on was respect. Not for himself, for he could take a lot, but for his wife. Once when I had strutted through the kitchen in a jovial mood and smacked my mother on her bottom as I passed. Greeting her with a shockingly inappropriate, "Hiya, bitch!" He quickly upbraided me for my insolence, and his anger was intimidating. I as quickly understood that I was way out of line. I eventually found new friends on East 24th Street, Clifford Seltzer, and East 23rd Street, Richard Rothstein, and Dominic Petrolango, and on East 21st, Joel Fishbein and Ira Warhol. But they weren't Michael Epstein and David Green, nor Buddy, Amy, Marcia, or Mark. Nevertheless, they were to become the most frequent companions of my early adolescence. There was one attempt to bring my two worlds together that turned instead into a final transition. It was Halloween, 1954. Mike Epstein and I went to the Elm Theater on Avenue M, my neighborhood, to see a movie. I had a stick of pastel chalk on me, and I chalked some kid's jacket. He reported me to the matron, and I was thrown out of the theater. Michael tried to argue my case. He's sorry, he won't do it again, but failed to persuade the chief usher. I left, he stayed. Disconsolate, in exile from the palace of pleasure, I met Richie Rothstein on the street. He heard my story and actually persuaded them to let me back in. But I couldn't find Michael. I found out later that he had missed me and gone to my house, thinking I must have gone home. There he met my father, working in our backyard, and asked for a ride back to 28th Street. My father, however, refused, so Michael had to walk home. I was angry at my father when I heard about it. Why didn't you give him a ride, I asked. Later I realized my father could have wondered why Michael had come back without me. What kind of a friend is that? I never blamed Michael, though. He fessed up pretty readily to his regret over having stayed in the theater. I could understand. And as for my father, well, sure, it was a little selfish of him, I suppose, to refuse to drive Mike home. But think of him. It's the weekend, time off from work, time to work in the garden, one of his great pleasures. And that time was just too precious to give it up, to take home a boy that apparently left his younger son in the lurch, or something. But the real upshot was that Richie became my best friend in my new neighborhood. And even though that relationship was a little rockier than the one I enjoyed with Mike, there's no reason to suppose it would always have been smooth sailing with him either. Over the years, my mother would occasionally press me to call Mike. Once she reported that he had called our home for me. He was a true friend, and I'm sorry our friendship didn't continue. But without the opportunity for frequent neighborhood contact, I didn't have the tools to nurture it. So, with your permission, I'm going to read one more section from this series of chapters.
Please. Do we need a brief break? No, we're okay? All right, I just want to check. That's great. Okay.
I'm just saying.
Good.
Okay. It's good to ask.
Yeah, it's good to ask.
This is called Delwood.
What?
Delwood. And that summer I went to Camp Delwood, 7 miles from Honesdale, Pennsylvania, where my brother Jerry was a 14-year-old senior and my cousin Mike, a 15-year-old camper waiter. At my mother's behest, my cousin Mike dropped by his 9-year-old cousin's bunk one evening to see how he was getting along. He found me regaling my bunkmates with stories and informed my mother that she had nothing to worry about. Mike was another champion of mine in the family. Even 15 years later, when I had become an itinerant poet in San Francisco, my mother's inquiries about my welfare still continued. Michael nonplussed her by responding, "You worried about Robert?" As was evident, I liked camp. I had a great summer. In one of those late night prepubescent conversations, I was even willing to confess I once showed my prick to a girl. This disclosure was in fact an understatement. I had shown my prick to a total of 6 girls, on at least 4 separate occasions. Diane Coleman, Carol Newman, Karen Smith, Sheila, I forget her last name, Sherry, who lived across the street from Michael and wasn't Jewish, who actually touched it, but who shrank away from squeezing it when I urged her to, and Michael's little sister, whom I tried to persuade to show me hers. After many entreaties, she complied and pulled her polka dot panties down and up so fast, I didn't see a thing. He asked me to show mine to him, but I wouldn't do it, she told her brother. "Good girl," he said. "Bad girl," I responded, even then knowing it was a cheap shot. His protective attitude by far more praiseworthy than my exploitative one. Of course, a sane person would wonder why I did it. And that's what Mike wanted to know, as we strolled in Bedford Avenue toward my house, perhaps on the day of that ill-fated movie matinee. Why? I could not explain it rationally. I could only say, I felt an urge. I even used that word, urge. I added, I hope Judge Leibowitz never finds out. Who was Judge Leibowitz? Mike wanted to know. He was a juvenile court magistrate who had a reputation for imposing stern sentences. He was in all the papers, and I'd come across some description of a trial over which he presided. Like Mr. Glickstein, he represented to me the voice of authority. He was the rule setter, the punisher. I, who so easily transgressed established norms, feared discovery and the consequent penalties, public exposure, and shame most of all. At this point, I was feeling the blowback from my deeds. Very New England Puritan, wouldn't you say? That society where offenders were put in the stocks and were forced to wear a scarlet A. In subsequent years, as the noose of public obloquy tightened, I remember wanting to say something to my father about what I was feeling and the web of circumstances in which I was enmeshed. I stepped into the living room through the fancy swinging doors, like a saloons in painted gold that Jerry and I had insisted remain part of our new home's decor, and looked at my father across the room where he sat on a sofa reading the paper by lamplight. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't open my mouth. From him, too, I think I feared rebuke. At camp, I could let down my guard. No one knew, and even my brief announcement made no ripples, stirred no interest. My friendship with Mark Tao, Peter Oberfest, and the other boys in the bunk blossomed. With Mark, I could laugh hysterically at the silliest pronouncement. Rabbi Dabbi, the smartest man in history mystery. Like Paul, he was fond of naughty verses. There's a Girl Scout in the grass with a bullet up her ass. Take it out, like a good Boy Scout. With some repetitions, he substituted Arlene in the grass, one of the anonymous Girl Scout. Who was Arlene? Some girl in the city of whom he was presumably enamored. Pete, let's say, was the more intellectual and the only one who could beat me in a foot race. He lost some of his speed later, but by then I had other competitors, so that, fast as I was, I never became number one. I returned to Delwood every summer until I was 15. and then went to another camp the following year after Delwood's owners, Norm Wolf and Rabbi Aaron, retired from the camping business and sold the old place, probably due in part to the aggravation the waiters caused them that final summer. Most of us had been Delwood campers for many years, but faced a new situation shortly after we arrived and took up our jobs. Rabbi Aaron, Isidore Aaron, had 2 sons who worked at the camp in the summer. Benny, the older one, had been in charge of the kitchen for several years. This summer, though, Norm and the rabbi had hired a new person to run things, and more particularly to supervise us. This fellow, probably an educator like Norm Wolf, took one look at our demeanor and tried to lay down some rules. The most onerous one to us was a requirement that we tuck in our shirts. We wore shirts that buttoned down the front with collars and tails. That was the prevailing style. Our universal preference was to let the tails hang out. Our job consisted of setting the tables, serving the food at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, carrying away the dirty dishes, and cleaning the tables after each meal. It was work. We were proud of the job we did. We had moved up the hierarchical ladder. Our parents paid half the amount that the ordinary campers paid, and at the end of the season, we could expect to be given tips by the campers' parents. We served in both dining rooms, the boys' side and the girls' side, and also at the staff table where the rabbi, Norm Wolf, and the head counselor sat. The 2 dining rooms were separated by a row of wooden doors that could be folded open for special occasions. As waiters, we had access to both dining rooms, a singular privilege, for although they were not hermetically sealed, there was an invisible line between the 2 domains. Into this delicately balanced situation strode our new overseer. He gave the order that we tuck in our shirt tails, and we refused. One by one, the rabbi approached us. I was not one of the early ones, but eventually he found me, improperly attired, and asked, "Robert, would you please tuck in your shirt?" "No." "Then you have to go outside with the others." By the end of the meal, all of us were on strike. We had a second cause, Mark Taub. Mark had discovered that he could squirt lighter fluid in his hand and ignite it and come to no harm. In our double wooden bunkhouse, he sprayed a stream of lighter fluid along the floor, lit it, and watched it burn out. We saw that it was harmless. The fire was never hot enough to catch onto the wood, and the fluid evaporated quickly. Into this mellow scene stepped our head counselor on a routine inspection tour. Appalled at what he saw, he took steps to expel Mark from camp. We wanted him back. At our caucus, we formulated 2 demands, an end to the new dress code and a reprieve for Mark. Shabbat fell between our inner conference and the meeting with the directors and staff on Sunday. We dressed in our Shabbos attire and attended services, filing into the back row and sitting on the green and gold wooden benches, our camp colors, in the rec hall. Our behavior was respectful. We had no issue with Judaism, nor the form of Judaism promulgated by the rabbi. Our issue was the dining room and the new standards imposed by the new supervisor. We demonstrated our essential loyalty while holding on to our principal differences. We chose Pete as our representative, our spokesperson. His diplomatic hedging soon got on Richie Lasky's nerves. "Stop beating around the bush, Pete. Tell him what we decided." "Okay," said Pete. "We want the new rule rolled back, and we want Mark to stay." The rabbi and Norm made 2 remarkable statements in response to these demands. First, they appealed to authority, their own. They actually said that they could not back down because doing so would imperil, would undermine their authority. What a crappy answer. They pretty much admitted they had no good reason not to let the rules revert to what they had been before. Right or wrong, they had to back up their guy, the new maitre d'. As for Mark, they said that he'd been trouble from the time he first enrolled in camp till now. That hurt us too. Imagine them having reservations by one of our own every year. Like me and Pete, he'd been coming to Delwood every summer for 7 years. But now that he had done something very dangerous, they had no recourse but to send him home. Not only that, but everyone who refused to cooperate with the new rules would have to go home too. Such individuals could call their parents right now and ask to come home. We got online, every one of us, and called our parents, one after the other, on the only outside line in camp. Every single parent said they would not countenance our coming home. We should stay for the duration of the summer. My own mother, when I spoke to her, said, "Oh, Robert, these kinds of things happen, and it's not worth throwing away a summer vacation for it. Besides, what would you do at home?" Pretty much a standard response. I suspect that the directors called every single kid's parents before the meeting, explained that there was a rebellion going on over a very minor matter, and that one of the boys had done a very dangerous thing which required his immediate expulsion. The others could stay if they followed the rules, and no refunds could not be made in the case of boys who refused to return home. The unanimity of their responses took us by surprise and left us little choice. We were stuck. But that was Delwood's last summer.